Um, as you may or may not know, this webinar is brought to you by the Ontario Trillium Foundation. We're working on a feasibility study to see how the hows and whys and whats of developing an archive for the local arts and culture community in Oakville. And this is a part of that grant. So we're very pleased to have Alana working for us on this feasibility study and to deliver these webinars. She's doing a fabulous job. She sure has a lot of great information from everybody, and we're getting some wonderful feedback from the first one. So I hope that you all get something out of this. At the end of it, we also have some USB drives for you. And Alana, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that you've put some information on those drives for people.
I'm going to load up a copy of these slides because they are sort of a resource in and of themselves. I might skip some things today because talking for 2 hours straight is not fun for anyone. But the slides are there for you to look at. And then there will be some other community guides, some resources, some templates, some examples of how records management things work and that sort of stuff. So these USB sticks are here and ready and waiting. And if you want one, just send us your mailing address. Which you can do by email. You can respond to the emails you've been getting and just send your email address and say, yes, I'd like one. Because we were originally planning on doing workshops in person for these. And now that they're webinars, obviously it's great that we have so many other people from all around the world who are joining us, but the handing out of stuff has been hindered a little bit. So we're going to do it by volunteer. If you want a USB stick, you must volunteer your address to me, and then we will put them in the mail for you.
Right, so I think without further ado, I'm just going to turn this over to Alana. And again, if you have any questions or concerns, just use the chat box and we'll do what we can.
Yep.
All right.
All right, if you don't know me, my name's Alana. That's who the voice is. I just want to open by saying really quickly, this is not an easy time for any of us, so there's no social etiquette you need to observe. If you need to leave at any time, feel free to do so. If you need to walk away and come back, feel free to do so, but mute yourself. As I said, I might skip over some material depending on how I feel and how the time is going, but the slides are here as a resource for you to look at anytime, and there's more information in them than I will get to today. You will be able to find my contact information on the last slide, and you can get in contact with me at any time if you have questions or you want to talk about a specific situation that we haven't mentioned today in the interactive portions, or if you want more detail about anything. Okay, that is it. The preamble, who am I? I am a digital archivist. I have been working in this sort of thing for quite a while. And I've been working from home actually for the past 3 or more years. So this is pretty normal for me, except for the whole impending societal doom part. So I'm trying to take it easy with myself as well, as I'm sure you all are. The Oakville Arts Council hired me, as Bernadette said, on an Ontario Trillium Foundation seed grant to do planning for this digital archive we're planning on building. The digital archive itself is going to be grant funded, so of course we're flexible, but we are hoping that we can get to it next year and work on it for a few years, which would be really lovely. We've been meeting with a lot of arts groups, including many of the people who you will hear from in the chat shortly. And we've been talking about what kind of materials they have, what format they're in, how we can best digitize them, and how we can put them online for people to be able to access them. And then other fun things we'd like to do as well, like virtual exhibits, research essays. We'd love to do in-person exhibits in the town of Oakville over the years of the project, and really make it a great, beautiful celebration of the legacy and accomplishments of all of these arts groups. I want to start speaking really generally about what archiving is and why we do it, and I think it's really important. I know a lot of you will have some familiarity with the concept of archiving government records or famous people records, literary things, but for what we're doing, it's more of an archive of everyday life, which to me is really important because we want to collect those records of society as a whole and not just sort of the most affluent or advantageous people. It's really recent, say in the last 50 years or so, that we are really focusing on different lived experiences, so like LGBTQ experiences, the records or experiences of immigrants and refugees, and that we would suddenly, where we didn't before, want your photo albums or your scrapbooks or your World War I love letters and that sort of thing. There's a really great guide that will be one of the resources we're going to include on those USB sticks. It's a guide to archiving for community organizations. Braden Cannon, who was working for the city of Halifax and the Nova Scotia Archives at that time, was writing about preserving the records of community groups. And so this is really important to our project and probably what you're experiencing as well. Many community organizations are not properly represented in archival holdings across Canada. This absence creates a gap in the historical record, and it creates difficulties for the groups themselves as organizational memory is lost with high turnover rates. This leads to a lot of redundant effort due to the fact that projects cannot be built upon if there is no record of the project ever being undertaken to begin with. So one of the things that Archives is great for is not reinventing the wheel and making sure that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past, which, as many of you know from your profit margins and your revenue streams, it's really nice to not make mistakes because we can't really afford to some of the time. And then I want to share another quote. This interview was just published a couple weeks ago. It's about the Stratford Festival Archives in Stratford, Ontario. I see articles and quotes like this go by all the time. This is just the most recent example. There's something really wonderful about having not just community archives, but specifically art and creativity archives. So this archivist there, the quote is that in most other archives where I've worked, researchers are interested in learning about the past, some element of history that's cut and dried and settled. At the Stratford Festival, most of our researchers come in because they're interested in creating something new for the future. And they want to go and see, you know, how was Hamlet done in the past and how can I improve upon the ways we've done it in the past and try something new? And can I see all the different variations and the different cuts and omissions and decide what I want to do based on what's been done in the past? So there's something really, really special about art archives, and that's certainly why I was interested in this project and why I want to work on it. As Bernadette mentioned, thank you to the Ontario Trillium Foundation, who are supporting the SEED grant, which is really, really exciting. They support a lot of archives and heritage work in this province. They have a whole stream for it, and it's super, super wonderful to have that kind of support. Wherever you may be, I hope you have something similar, since we do have people from across the country and all around the world joining us today. So this is the agenda that I have planned for us today. I'm going to skim some things, as I mentioned. You can certainly come back and look at this, and this is your last chance to keep yourself muted, because from here on out it's all interactive all the time. So just in case you missed the warning before, we are recording, so if you do not want to be participating, stay on mute. So the agenda, we're going to work kind of through the process. We're actually going to start at the end. We're going to start and talk about archives as a crash course with some jargon and some terminology, and then we're going to go sort of back to the beginning of you and how that matters for you and the things that you create, how you want to keep them organized, how you want to take care of them, and then eventually how you want to preserve them long-term in an institution. Okay, so when there's lots of pictures like this is an interactive slide. So this is where I want to pause and do some icebreakers. I'm hoping that some of you will take this opportunity to introduce yourselves and tell us a bit about your situation and where you're at. I think it's about 50-50 that we have individuals who are artists and individuals who work for arts organizations. And I know that there are some archival colleagues of mine, and some of you are going to have experience with the after picture that's on the right, of everything kind of neatly organized and set up. And then for the rest of you, you will have a closet or a basement or an attic or the under the bed space in your house that looks probably a little bit like the image on the left. This is the artistic version of that, but you probably have something like that. So feel free to unmute yourself and talk, or introduce yourself in the chat. Julian, you are unmuted.
Great. Yeah, I thought I'd just introduce myself. So I'm Julian Kingston, and I take care of the Oakville Museum. And whereas we do have a small archive of our own, and it's something that we manage on an ongoing basis and are in the incremental process of digitizing. My interest on this kind of, in this larger project, is sort of like to just kind of keep my finger on the pulse of where this project goes and what it involves. And you know, because it's kind of our job to collect Oakville stories writ large, I thought it'd be good if I just sort of keep an eye on what's going on, so that you know, we don't duplicate effort, but then also have the ability to collaborate and find synergies as we do this thing.
And Oakville's such an interesting jurisdiction because you're actually sort of the definitive repository of the town of Oakville's stuff. The Oakville Historical Society has the agreement with the town to be the place where the records and the archives go, all the paperwork and the documents, and then you get all the stuff, which is a really fascinating way to do it. I don't know too many other municipalities that choose to do it that way. But
yeah, I'm not sure that was done on purpose, actually.
Yeah, you've sort of dodged the bullet of dealing with archival stuff, which
there
is nice
is a story behind it, which I won't burden everybody with, but yeah, it's not like it was planned that way.
No, not quite. Wendy, you are up next. Wendy, who has her hand up and is unmuted but is not speaking. Nope, we're going to pause on Wendy. I'm going to read out Annette, who I've been in email contact with. If I am recalling correctly, you do not live in Oakville, but you run the Wearable Art Show, which is run every year in Oakville, which is fantastic. So nonprofit group. The Wearable Art Show is a really, really neat festival of, I call it a festival. There's booths, you can buy all sorts of incredible wearable, yes, Guelph, that's right. We went, it was one of the first things I did when I started my contract, was visit the Wearable Art Show, which is a really nice little crash course to Oakville and the creativity of the community. Veronica is also in the chat, who's a textile artist who does mixed media and printing. We have a lot of textile artists. The fiber and craft scene in Oakville is really, really incredible. So you're in company. You're in good company right now. If anyone else wants to volunteer a little bit of information about themselves and their situation. I think we've lost Wendy, unfortunately. Well, technology is never, ever evenly distributed as much as you would like it to be. You can continue to introduce yourselves in the chat if you'd like. A lot of people are sitting back and being quiet, and that's fine. We can read them out more later, and there will be lots more chances to ask questions and talk about your situations later as well. I don't know how to pronounce your name, and I feel really bad about it. I've been seeing some emails from you, and if you are willing to unmute yourself and say your name out loud, I would love to get it right and not mangle it horribly.
You might be talking about me.
I am.
This is Hermione speaking. I'm
Hermione, great.
And I am. What I'm interested in is, I think a lot of us are going to leave this world and leave a bunch of stuff behind in our houses. And I don't know how important or unimportant that may be, but I'm curious as to whether you have suggestions or solutions for that.
Absolutely. Unfortunately, I have lots of practical suggestions, but I don't have an answer to the wide world question of how important it is.
I can take that.
Yeah, as we'll talk about, you know, importance is unfortunately not the single most defining feature of whether an archive decides to preserve something. We're going to get to that, so you're segueing into some interesting things here. Okay, I'm going to move on to the first section because that was a really great segue. So we're going to talk about some terminology and some concepts and some jargon, and we're going to get a crash course in what an archive is and how it works. The first thing I'm going to do is define what a record is. Throughout this presentation, you're going to hear me say records or stuff or materials or artifacts or paperwork or documents. By that, I mean records. That's the proper terminology that I want to employ here. Anything that is fixed format. So any evidence of the stuff that you do as an artist or as an arts organization that is not real life stuff. So you might have video recordings of a concert or of a dance. You might not have any other sort of notation of that dance notation being notably difficult to capture, but you might have a video recording of it, or you might have some very limited sketches of different positions or something like that. We can't necessarily capture the dance in all of its glory, but we can capture these other documentation pieces that can sort of add up to the whole. So it's more normal that you're going to have some what we might consider to be boring records, receipts, invoices, contracts, emails, phone call logs, texts, database entries, that kind of stuff. Those are all really important. I know I said boring, but they are important. And then those go along with the really exciting things, which is the audio recordings and the video footage and the photos and the copies of your concert programs and the posters that you make and all that exciting stuff. Those are all records. We treat them differently based on what they are, but they're all records. And an archive is a term that gets thrown around a lot these days. You know, we talk about archiving our old emails and that sort of thing, but I'm going to use a very specific definition today, which is not just a bunch of records that aren't being used anymore, but a bunch of records that aren't being used and then have been organized into a permanent order. They've been appraised for long-term value and they've been documented for future reference. So a single archive is a collection. We might call it a series or papers, or we might call it a fond, which is a very technical term. If I say archives plural, there's a good chance I'm talking about an institution that collects archives. So an archives collects archives, which are records. I hope that's not too confusing. So archives would be organizations like the Archives of Ontario, or they might be departments specifically in corporate or in municipal places like the Scotiabank archives that hold those collections. Stuff isn't archived. This is something I really want to get across to you today. Stuff isn't archived unless it's been appraised for long-term value and it's been preserved properly and it's been organized and that there's access to it. Access is a really big part. And I'm going to come back to that again and again. So you might want to use the word archive to say, well, I put all the stuff in the basement, but that's not what we consider to be archived. So records have a life cycle, and there is record death, and we're going to talk about that as well. So records are considered to be active, or, you know, if you want to say alive, that's fine too. Records are active at the moment of creation, when you're using them, when you're modifying, when you're referring back to them because you want to see how you did something last year, that sort of thing. That's an active record, when it's still being useful to the creator or the owner. So you might be referring back to a report you wrote years ago because you want to go back and see, well, what did we do in our annual plan or our strategic report or whatever. A template like a letterhead stays active for a really, really long time, maybe decades. A record becomes inactive as soon as you stop using it. And that is sort of a fuzzy gray area because you might put something away in your Google Drive and then think about using it maybe 3 years later. And it wasn't necessarily active that whole time, but it's been sort of sitting, not being very active until that moment when you refer to it again. We say that things are conclusively inactive when you absolutely have no longer use for them at all. And then a record, once it's become inactive, becomes archival again when it becomes assessed and incorporated into an archival collection. Once a record becomes inactive and you appraise it, there's a good chance that it will be considered not very valuable in the long term, and then you would probably destroy it. It's very important to specify an inactive record is not an archive. An inactive record, even in offsite storage, is not an archive. These things that make things archives are appraisal, arrangement, description, preservation, and access. So let's walk through some examples real quickly. You probably have lots of invoices. It stays active for many, many years because you need it for tax and legal purposes. It still needs to be referred to just in case you get audited, that sort of thing. Sorry, I think I misspoke there for a second. It's active when it's being used for your business purposes, and then it becomes inactive and sits for a long time when you have to keep it for tax and legal purposes, just in case you get audited. So we probably keep those things for 7 years. Then we assess it for long-term value. There's a good chance your invoices will not be long-term value, and then you'll be able to destroy them. For many of you who work as individuals who take self-employment income or work for an arts group, you will be very familiar with these things. And if you're not familiar with them, you should get familiar with them quickly because you will get into trouble. It's not to say that all invoices are not valuable. There are lots of very old invoices that are fascinating, but as you know, it's the 21st century and we make a lot of records. So most of them not that valuable. Conversely, a concert program that you make for your concert year becomes inactive after the concert. You probably keep it for a really long time. At some point, your filing cabinet's going to be overflowing and you're going to want to get rid of things from years past. There's a good chance you have 20 copies, you're going to throw out 18 or 19 of them, and then these records, you're probably going to sort of appraise them at that point. Do I want to keep 1 or 2 of these? Yes, you absolutely do. Those concert programs really do have long-term value, and you can feel that. You don't want to throw out the only surviving copy of those things. At that point, eventually, you will enter into what I like to call the archives purgatory. So there's sort of only 2 options, and then the third, which is the purgatory for things that become inactive. Option 1 is that they sit in your house for a while, and then you find a long-term repository to give them to, and they become archival in that sense, where there is an archives worker taking care of them. Option 2 is that it sits in your basement and then there's a flood or a leak and it gets destroyed and then it's gone forever. Or as we were talking about, Hermine mentioned, some of those things, you know, you don't know what to do with them, and maybe they get passed down from family member to family member, and that's the purgatories. Things either get destroyed or they go to the archives, but there's also maybe 20 years or 50 years or hundreds of years where these things sit and get passed on and get shepherded by person to person to person, and one of those 2 things doesn't happen anytime soon. That worries me. It's not a great position for those things to be in, but the purgatory certainly is better than having things that are really important get destroyed by a disaster. So my job and my professional calling is to limit that purgatory and try and get these things appraised and taken care of as quickly as possible. If they're not good, I love destroying things. If they are good, I love keeping them. But I really, really worry mostly about those sort of attics and closets and under the bed collections. Those are the ones that really, really worry me. We talk about records classification, which is to say you probably have some sort of organizational system as an individual or as an organization. It might just be some folders in your hard drive. It might be some folders in your filing cabinet. Maybe you organize things the moment you create them, and maybe you only organize them when they start to build up in a giant pile, and then you have to sort them. Both of them are okay. You really don't need to worry too much about having the most advanced classification system in the universe. Another thing that's really nice these days, especially in digital, is being able to classify things purely by the format that they're in and moving those things around by basically what kind of file type they are. That part's really, really nice. Some of you probably don't do that, and some of you aren't dealing with things like that giant collection of photos on your phone until you run out of space. Again, that's okay too. It's not the worst thing in the world to have a big jumbled up mess. Again, in digital, things are easier and easier than ever to sort by the date they were created, the file format, the size, whether it's the raw original image or something that you've edited and posted on social media, the place where you find them, it's much, much easier to classify things now than ever before, which is wonderful. But what you'll find, and I'm about to show you, is the way that archives like to have stuff organized is the way that makes the most sense to you as the records creator. So we might receive things at the archives as your personal papers, and we might sort them out into correspondence and financial documents and event paperwork and do sub chunks like this. But there's a much better chance that we're going to keep things more or less in the way that you organize them, because that's really important for us. This is an example that I want to point out a few things on. One is that almost everyone in the world is not going to be creating systems that are 20, 50 folders deep. Too much organization is just about too complicated for everyone. I don't know if this is scientifically documented in psychology, but it seems like a lot of people work with 2 or 3 folders or maybe 5 folders. And most archives, we really like to do about five levels of hierarchy deep. That works out really well for us. This is something that is really nice. It's win-win because we like keeping it in this system so that researchers can use it, and you probably like having a relatively simple organizational system so that you can find stuff. It's really not necessary to obsessively organize the things. And it's just important to recognize the system that works for you and maybe even write it down so that you and other people can figure out where you keep stuff if you're having, you know, a brain fart moment and you can't remember precisely what your own organizational system is. There was something else I wanted to point out about it. I guess these terminology over on the left, collection, series, sub-series, those sorts of things, archives will stick that on at the end. You don't need to think in that way, of course. But like I said, you know, 5 is usually plenty. I wanted to give you an example of something that is in the National Arts Centre collection in Ottawa, which is the Art Metropole collection. Art Metropole is in Toronto. They were an artist-run center. They do a lot of artist books, and they donated a collection of about 10 meters, so about 30 bankers boxes, to the National Arts Centre. And this is how it was received and described and put up on the website. You are going to see here that the whole collection, the fond, spans 17 years. It's been organized into series. This is sort of how they kept these records. The years on each of these series are kind of all over the place. Grants is kind of, yeah, well, whatever. And then you're going to see these individual folders here in box 1 and box 2 over on the right. This is not chronological. It's not alphabetical. It doesn't really make a lot of sense. It must have made sense to them at the time as they were making it, but it hasn't been significantly rearranged by the archivist. There's a reason for that. We secretly, not so secretly, we consider it to be really intellectually useful to researchers to see how records creator kept their stuff. We find it interesting to think that you would put these two things beside each other for some reason or another. So researchers 100 years from now are going to be going, why is that like that? And it's going to be really useful for them to see that context. So they might be ordering one specific file out of your collection, but they're going to get a whole box. And then they're going to be able to page through that whole box and go, oh, I see. So it, like I said, is a bit of a win-win for everyone. It's helpful for those researchers to be able to see one record in the context of its neighbors. It's easier on archival staff not to have to make up a whole new system for everything. And it's certainly easier for you to know how things are going to look in the end. So the principle that we operate, number 1, is called original order. It really just means that we document the order in which we get stuff. So when you take stuff out of your filing cabinet and put it in boxes and send it over to the archives, we pay attention to that order. And then rule number 2, of course, is just that we tidy it up a little bit so that it's not total chaos. There are going to be obvious sort of intellectual groupings and functional groupings in the way you did things. And if we find a few emails tucked in on the top of the box or crushed down at the bottom, we're going to put them back to where we think they probably go. But that's about it. So what's useful for you as a record creator? Don't worry about the future is number 1. Should be number 1. I know it's number 2, but I've already said number 1. So we'll go strictly to number 2. Don't worry about the future too much. Try to make a system that works really well for you. Don't get too nervous about the idea that people are going to see that you're messy. Everyone is messy. Don't worry about it. Don't be too nervous about this idea that you need to curate your legacy. I know we're all artists and we like things to be aesthetically pleasing, but there's also something really magical and important about the thing that works for you as a creative person. However that creative process works for you, we want to know about it. It's really important. Number 4 is extremely important. Keep your stuff safe. Keep it away from sunlight, keep it away from humidity, keep it away from floods, fires, leaks, and pests. And the most important thing is don't put it on the floor. Get it up off the floor no matter where it may be. Number 5 is, as we were talking about, you might have a closet full of stuff and you might not really enjoy going into the closet, but you do need to check on it at least occasionally to know that it's still in good shape, and to remind yourself that it is sort of an outstanding task that you might want to tackle, such as in an extended period of being trapped inside your home with nothing else to do. You might want to consider maybe going into the closet this week. Just an idea. Okay, so we are on an image slide again, which means it is a moment of me asking if you have more questions, because this is the end of this crash course section. So I know that some people have been typing a little bit, and if anyone else has questions, Julian has his hand up, so go ahead, Julian.
Yeah, less of a question, more of a confession. So just to put everybody at ease, right? So I'm not a collections person like at core. Like really, my background, I came up through museums more in education and programming. But I've spent 30 years in museums, and you get inculcated with collections and concerns just by doing that. I have had and do currently have overall responsibility for collections. But as a kind of an anecdote, like my brothers and sisters and I had to clean out my parents' house when my father passed away a couple years ago,
Mhm.
and it was quite a collection there, let me tell you. And so the most what at least I thought to be the most important parts of that, I have saved, but I have not. You could not call it an archive. It currently sits in my basement. However, it is protected in a case and it is off the floor, and I do check it.
Yep, that's good. That's a good start. Something we're going to talk about in a little bit, because now that we've gotten to the end of the process, we're going to go back to the beginning of the process, is of course, the sooner you deal with it, the better, and not to be too insensitive. Obviously, death and grieving is its whole complicated process that we all have some experience with. But the problem that is created when someone in your family dies and you receive their records is that you don't have them there to tell you who's in the photographs, to tell you why they kept this one thing. If you have the ability and you can find the time and you can make this happen with your loved ones before they go away, to sit down and go through the stuff that you think they might be leaving behind, and make sure you know what it is and who's in the photos and what they thought was special about these things. It is a really nice process. It can be really fun if you get a chance to do it, and it certainly makes things a little easier and less complicated later on when you're already dealing with complicated things. I just realized
Yeah, well,
I forgot to explain these photos, so I'm going to do that really quickly. This is the scared straight slide. This is the don't do this. This is the worst case scenario. These are from a colleague of mine who works for religious archives in the States. So this is the condition of some of the things that he has received in course of his work. The picture on the left is just nonsense. There's books, there's empty notepads, there's things that are folded and crushed and ripped. The box itself has been crushed. Don't give things in this order. You can, it obviously has been done, but I wouldn't recommend it. And then the photo on the right is actually, I think, a manuscript that came in a reasonably good order, but something was put in the top of the box that was plastic, and then at some point the plastic disintegrated and turned into these little fish flakes that are all over the place. So this is where the checking on it occasionally comes in. Your stuff might be in reasonably nice order in a box and taken care of, but if you happen to let some other materials slide in there and materials disintegrate at different rates, this is what can happen. Okay, so we have some other comments. Annette says everything is safe and in one spot. You did do some labeling, which is good. You know, every little bit counts. And Victoria asks, what should people be aware of when they're storing items in an attic? Attics are a funny place. Generally speaking, they have some of the worst temperature fluctuations and humidity fluctuations. So heat rises, or your roof gets really hot in the summer and things start to melt, or any moisture that happens to be up there will start to rust things away or cause mold. And of course, if there's a roof leak, that's what's going to get hit first and foremost. So attics are a scary place. Basements are bad for flooding. Attics are bad for leaks and, of course, for fires as well. And generally speaking, things are not going to stay in the condition that you put them in if you put them in either of those places, because there's always going to be some sort of humidity problem. We're going to talk about that in a little bit as well, and I'm going to give you a crash course in that, but it's generally speaking, you know, the number one thing you can do for things is make sure there's a minimum of moisture in the container that you put it in, and then put it in a moisture safe container. I love Rubbermaid tins. They're not great, but they do a lot of really good things. So Rubbermaid tubs are always superior to cardboard boxes, just about no matter how you slice it. Rodents, here we go. Yeah, pests in your attic, pests in your basement. They can come at any time. They can come to any place in your house and they can nibble away. And again, that is a really great check on it occasionally thing, because even if things are perfectly safe, if you don't look at them for 5 years and the pests get in, you never know what can happen.
I see Wendy has her hand up as well. Wendy, did you have a question?
Or is that a leftover hand from earlier?
Or is that, yeah. She had a question earlier about what would be preferable in terms of digital or physical copies. And
Oh, yeah. That's definitely coming up. We're definitely going to talk about that and about Anne's question shortly.
Sorry, Julian, I'll just jump in for 1 second, just to do a big +1 on like getting the records in as they were collected.
Mm-hmm.
I can just say from like going through my dad's stuff, the stuff that I got the way he left it was way easier to figure out than the stuff that's all shuffled from various family members going through it. So that's just like, again,
yeah,
to think about.
That intellectual grouping thing really does work, doesn't it?
Yeah, totally. I never really
that's-
thought about it until I had to do it with like stuff that I was actually pretty close to, and I went, oh my God, this is so much easier.
Yep, totally. And yeah, that's where that archives purgatory comes in again. The longer things sit around and the more they get passed on, the more hands they go through, the more chance they have of getting influenced by other factors, which can be really hard to unravel at the end. It's like a ball of yarn that's been thrown all over the place. Okay, I am going to move on. We're going to go back to the very beginning of what it is you do as artists and as arts group members, and we're going to talk about the things that you make. Okay, so we are going to talk first about records. We're going to talk about artworks in a minute. First of all, the records that you do have are probably going to be in both physical and in digital now, of course. The longer back we go, the more physical things become, and we're not yet at the point where everything is digital and we can just ignore the left side of the slide as much as we'd like to. So we consider things to be analog. There's a good chance you have notebooks, drafts, sketches, sketchbooks. You might be doodling on all sorts of things that are hard to preserve. Napkins is one of them. I love saving doodles on napkins. I think they're fantastic. Do not throw those out. You might have a copy of a published work, sheet music, or scripts that you have put your own annotations on. That becomes an original record all over again, which is a fun concept. If you have put marginalia in the margins of your books, if you've written things in the margins of your books, that book is now an archival document, which is fascinating. Things that you make for publication, things like handbills and flyers, books that you publish, prints, those things that have your copyright and are published in their multiples, they're still a record. At least one of them is. You have all sorts of boring paperwork like contracts, grants, awards, commissions, thank you notes from people, certificates, awards from things that you've juried. All of your financial documents, of course, we have talked about and we'll talk about again. There are all sorts of things that document, like I was talking about before, document things that happen in real life in real time that can't necessarily be documented really well, but we can sort of recreate a dance, or we could recreate a theater production. We could recreate an exhibit based on diagrams and plans and the video and audio footage that you have. So those are all really important. You might have props, you might have costumes, you might have lists of props and costumes, you might have databases filled with entries of props and costumes. Those are all records. We will take the best available one, basically. Photographs, VHSs, cassettes. We've talked about some people in the audience today who have cassettes. Can't wait to digitize those. And then, of course, in the digital, we have to kind of expand our brain in terms of what we talk about for fixed format. So entries in databases and spreadsheets are fixed format. They can be tricky because they're also kind of dynamic. So where one of the cells in your spreadsheet is a formula that can change all the time and you want to grab only the output or only the formula, complicated. We will talk about it, but it's still a record. PDFs that you have filled out for things like applications, audio and video and photos on your phone, pictures of documents that you've signed and taken a picture of with your phone, events in your calendar, that is a record. Notepad files, memos, notes to yourself, Google Drive documents, complicated things like Photoshop or three-dimensional modeling files. Those things are complicated, but they're still records. Your website, of course, is a record. I want to point out that these are just not things that you create, but also things that you receive. Thank you notes you get in the mail. Calendar events created by someone else that you went to. These things are not all of your creation. You're not always the creator, but you can be the owner. And so these things all make up your personal or your organizational archive in some way. I want to plant this seed really quickly. As a group or as an individual, there are lots of really important things out there that you might not consider yourself to be receiving that you might want to try and receive or capture. So text messages, chat logs, copies of your social media posts, but also copy of social media posts from your fans and your audiences and from visitors of your exhibit or your audience members. Of course, you know to collect news clippings and reviews, but you should be thinking a little more broadly about what you consider to be a review. Online comments about your book on Goodreads or about your album on Bandcamp or about the videos that you post to YouTube are really, really important. These things should be captured for you. Certainly you should base the worth it or not worth it question on whether you have time and whether you have the ability and the tech savviness to go and capture those things. But you should really think about collecting those comments and that feedback for things like grant applications or annual reports or for building your portfolio. Those things can be really, really valuable to you, especially as a creative person. Your mood's really important. So if you are feeling not so inspired, going and looking at kind comments from your audience members can really help. And having that stuff around can really bolster your ability to create things. So that's really important. You can kind of trick yourself psychologically into being a little more productive in some days if you have this kind of stuff. So again, only if you have the technological ability. Sometimes it can be really difficult and it's more time than it's worth, but do consider collecting these things if you have a shot at it. Okay, so a great question. Artworks, are they records? You're probably asking. It's a really great question, but I would argue that that's not the most useful framing. Of course, you would rather have an artwork sold or donated than have it sitting with your record. That's not, that's a perfect world. It's probably not the real world. There's a good chance that your artworks, you have some extra art pieces lying around, things that you exhibited in a group show and came back home with you or something like that. First and foremost, you should always try to sell and donate them. That's really important. There's no reason for you to be not selling art. The thing that I want to mention is that if you were to donate an artwork or to sell an artwork, there's a chance that the collecting institution or the collecting individual would ask you for archival documents to go along with it. Provenance is really important. So if you have a beautiful painting that you've made or a sculpture, and someone commissions you for it or they buy it from you, there's a really good reason that they're going to want a copy of all that paperwork so that they can prove where they got it. And so that when they sell it and pass it on, they have that documentation to share. I'm not necessarily saying you should give the originals or you should give copies. That's totally up to you. You may have a very good reason to keep originals, or you may only want copies of that sort of thing. They may have a better argument than you do for those originals. And especially if it's an organization like the Art Gallery of Ontario that has a library and archives where they collect all of these archival documents, you can trust that they're going to take care of the originals really well. And that's really important. So you want to make sure that you ask. That's the main thing I want to get across. If a collecting institution wants to buy something or wants a donation, ask if they want those archival documents and ask if they know how to take care of them because they have archives workers and an archival collection in their institution. There are, as much as I am an archivist and a nonprofit worker, I think you should really, business comes first and you should get that money. I would never argue against that. One thing that I want to say is that if a collection wants your art and they will take some of your archives with them, they would be a good place to get in touch with later when you want to donate the rest of your archival documents because they already have some of it, which is great. Okay, so here's some boring financial stuff. Records and the record's life cycle and how long something stays active and when it becomes inactive and when you're allowed to destroy it or assess it for long-term viability. These things are enshrined in law, as you probably know as a person who makes money or a part of a group that makes money. These things are this Canada Revenue Agency and Ontario on the next slide, those things take precedence over everything else. And that's a really good way to get your kind of records organizational system in order, is to think about things, documents under these categories, and then on the next slide to talk about the retention period for them as set down in law. So you absolutely have to keep financial documents that summarize your transactions and support these transactions. You cannot claim income if you have absolutely nothing to back it up. You should be familiar with all this stuff already, but if not, you can click on that link later. The CRA suggests periods of time that you should keep things in that inactive status. So some of these things are kept forever. Meeting minutes kept forever. A minimum of 2 years after your charity or your nonprofit ceases to exist or stops having that status. Giant donations, you need to keep those records. All your ledgers and financial stuff, I say 7 years because it's 6 years from the end of the tax year. These things are all really important, and these periods of inactive records keeping is called a records retention period. I didn't introduce that term earlier, but retention is a very important word. In Ontario, if you are an incorporated nonprofit or charity, they have all sorts of fun instructions. So, of course, keeping meeting minutes, financial records, your incorporation papers, and an official register of your members and directors is really important. And then they also have very important suggestions. They have rules outlining, your organization has to have rules outlining how your records are retained and stored. You have to have a guide or a document, some sort of policy in place about your records. You have to have a clear labeling system. It recommends that you keep your records at head office and you keep your historical records offsite. I'm gonna temper that by saying this is very good legal advice, and I am not a lawyer, but this is not always financially viable for people. You may not have a head office, you may not have the ability to have a safe offsite location. It's up to you to put things where they are safest. And the safety of things is precedent over any specific instructions like these. So your head office might not exist, or it might not be safe, and your headquarters, wherever they may be, if it's a room in your house, that may be the safest location for things. So don't necessarily keep your inactive records offsite if you can't, or if it doesn't make sense to you. Oh, an image slide means I am pausing for questions. What about promotional materials for a film festival, such as signage? It depends on the size of the signage. I get the inkling that you're talking about large things that are complicated to keep. Yeah. So here is something that I'm going to talk about again later with things like props and costumes. Big bulky items are really hard to keep. As much as you would like to, it's totally a question of whether you can afford it, whether you have the physical space for it, if it makes sense, if you think you'll ever use it again, if you think it might have some utility past the time when you used it. So the best answer for those usually is take a photo. Take a photo of it, record the fact that you had it, record roughly, you know, what size it was and when you used it, and if it was made just for you, you know, who made it. Take a photo and then get rid of it. Photo collections of things like costumes is really, really fantastic, not just because it saves you the space of keeping the costumes forever, but also you can go back and go, oh, that's what I did. Oh, that was really nice. Oh, maybe I'll try and make that again. Or there was something I didn't like about that, and I'm going to try copying this, but making it better. Any kind of documentation is good, is better than no documentation. And when you throw stuff out, it's always nice. Take a digital photo.
So, Alana, there's a question here from Anne going back a bit about savings items that you've written or painted if they were never displayed or published. Should those be kept?
My 15-year-old self is clamoring to answer this question. I think process is really, really important and interesting for artists. If you are, you know, toying with an idea and it never comes of anything, it's still good practice. It still taught you something. It still gave you a chance to exercise those creative muscles. For a lot of, as we'll talk about later, a lot of the determination that an archivist makes to appraise things for long-term value is reliant on not just whether it in itself is valuable, but if it's useful in the context of a whole person's life, or very practically, how much space does it take up and how much space do we have in the archive. So for you, if it isn't a too onerous thing to keep it all, keep it and let someone else do the appraisal. Let an objective third person do the appraisal. If it's horribly embarrassing, like the stuff I made when I was 15 years old, and you don't want anyone to see it, I give you permission to destroy it right now. If that's what you're looking for, I'm happy to give you that permission. But it is always going to be better for someone else to take a look at those things and tell you what they think than for you to sit there and go, well, I don't really know. the stuff I made when I was 15 is not valuable now because I'm not a famous artist now. But if I become a famous artist in my 60s, then that stuff is suddenly going to be retconned into having value again, right? So it's never too late. It's never too early. And like I said, if it's horribly embarrassing, it's totally up to you. Did I miss anyone else? Is there anyone else who has anything to say at this time or anything they'd like to share? Okay, so we're going to move on to, now that we have an idea of what kind of records you have, how do we keep them organized? We're going to go back to this. Remember this? Like I said, the way archives presents things is more or less how they receive them. More or less, it certainly varies by the individual institution and by the individual person who processed it. But feel free to go and look at these kinds of things of famous people or arts groups that are similar to you to get ideas of how people organize things, but it doesn't have to be how you do it. As I said before, your organizational system and how you keep things should really work for you. It should be more about making your processes smoother and better. It should be about documenting the stuff that you do so that you can look back at it later and be proud of it. And it should be findable. So if you are an individual and you're the only person who ever accesses these records, certainly making it just for you is great. But do also keep in mind that maybe now or maybe someday in the future you could have an assistant or an intern or a husband or someone you can make help out with these sorts of things. So do having things labeled clearly and findable, not just you, but the person who processes this stuff or keeps it in order for you or tidies up after you is really, really important. You are not always going to be paying that much attention to how you file things, so labeling things clearly and standardized and having a guide that explains to future you how past you did it is always nice. There are file naming conventions. This is sort of a throwaway comment. You can click on that link later and go and look at file naming conventions for digital objects. So if you're saving lots and lots of things into a Google Drive and then trying to search later to find them, labeling your files in a standardized and clear way, whether it's, you know, the year and then the month and then the day and then the department or the type of event you're putting on and then sorting it out through there. That stuff's really important. It might be more than you need at this time. If your folder system is good, your file naming conventions probably don't need to be so good. But it depends on the size of the organization or how many people you have helping you. Definitely determines how detailed you want to be in these things. So again, physical things, keep them somewhere that authorized people and multiple people can access it. Because you don't want to be the single point of failure as an individual or working for a group. You also want to keep it safe from where unqualified people can't mess it up. That's really important. So physically, we're talking about locks on your drawers and your filing cabinets. Digitally, we're talking about passwords. Just make sure that multiple people have access that you trust and nobody that you don't trust has access. And again, sunlight, humidity, floods, fires, leaks, and pests. Always, always be aware of that. And we'll talk about the digital equivalent of that later as well. So here are just some ideas, some common organizational systems that people like to use. You can sort things certainly chronologically first and foremost is really great. And then sorting it by the program or the department under there. Sorting things by material type or by format is really good. You might actually, instead of having a system that everyone adheres to, you might allow each department or each person to sort things in their own way and allow them to sort of come up with their own system inside that. You will probably want to ask them to do things chronologically, of course. And then the last thing I suggest on this slide, of course, is paying attention to the medium or the format that things are in. This is what I would argue everyone should be doing first and foremost. There's absolutely no reason for your filing cabinet to have one VHS per concert tucked in amongst all of your papers. Sorting out video and putting that aside. Sorting out photographs and keeping them aside, keeping all your letter-sized black and white papers in one place and then all of your fancy glossy posters in another place is really, really good for preservation purposes that we're going to talk about later. Having that stuff separated out and then sort of going within that Using the same system within each of those collections is really important so that you know where to find stuff. Certainly some of these things are just going to be chronological. Sometimes you're going to have all of your photographs that are more or less chronological, but you're also going to have your concert season and then your special events and then your gala and your fundraisers. So not always fully chronological. Sometimes you're going to want to keep those in a different order. So this, like I said, record keeping is relatively finite. We like to think that we're all special and unique, but we really do make sort of the same kinds of records over and over. There's only so many different records that any person in the world can produce. So these common systems will probably cover just about everything for you. No matter what you choose, write a guide. It can be a short little one-page guide. It can be a short little one-page guide that says, here's how we do it. And it just has this information. And that's it. And then if you find yourself coming up with a whole new folder, a whole new way to organize something, add it into the guide. Don't forget to document, well, we had this stuff that didn't fit anywhere, so we created a new section for it. Put it in the guide every time you do that. I want to talk about turnover. This is specific to the groups here, but certainly if you're an artist and you get an assistant for 6 months at a time from the local school, you experience turnover as well. It is really, really important that you pay attention to the way that your board members or your volunteers come and go. And make sure that if you've given someone some authority, if you've given someone the password to the account, or you've created an extra administrator account for that person, make sure that when they leave, you get it back from them. You want to change those passwords and change that account administration. You want to make sure that if they were the only one controlling the Google Drive, that they gave you the Google Drive now. And then the first thing you want to do is make sure there's a second person on it. If people are keeping physical records and they have them at home, make sure they bring them in. Make sure that if they have a set of keys, you get them. And the last thing you want to do when someone leaves, and I know this is also a gray area, sometimes you don't hear from someone for 6 months and that's how they leave, which is not the same thing as them saying, I'm not going to volunteer for you anymore. But do consider having some sort of exit paperwork that they do with a checklist with these things. So you can say, oh, are you leaving the organization? Did you give back the keys? Yes, yes, yes. Is there anything else you think we should know about the stuff you made while you were with us? Do you give us authorization to use posters that you made that are under your copyright? Those sorts of things. You want to consider those things. So I can't go in this detail. This is also sort of a throwaway comment, but do consider that your turnover has some reflection in the systems that you use around your records, and make sure that your records are still safe and available, regardless of who comes and goes. Okay, so procedures and policies are boring, I know. I wish I could give you a policy template for this and save you all the work. There are actually several real-world policies at that link that you can go and look at. They're not a perfect template, but you can certainly copy them if you'd like. You will have to write your own to some extent eventually. It can be really, really short and simple. Like I said, a one-page guide to your organizational system that you stick in the front of the filing cabinet, or is the first document sitting inside your Google Drive folder titled README. That's really all you need. You just want people to be able to see that you're adhering to legal requirements, adhering to best practices, and that someone's taking responsibility for this stuff. It might be you, it might be the executive director, it might be a board member, it might be some lowly volunteer. You just want to make sure that someone is doing this. It's really important to explain what things get created, who creates them, what needs to be kept, how long it needs to be kept, and then what doesn't need to be kept, because lots of things you create every day can just be thrown out every day. It's not always necessary to keep everything for 7 years and then assess it then. You do want to have a part of it that explains, of course, where things are physically kept if you do have long-term storage somewhere off-site, and you do need to make sure that you write down who has access to it and how access gets transferred. Make sure that's in your policy. Tax time is a really good occasion to write these and to keep them up to date, so do review them regularly. Okay, so now we're going to talk about physical and digital. I would say, as I mentioned before, if you're organizing things by format, if you are keeping your paperwork in one place and your photographs in another, you're replicating that organizational system within both of those. You want to do the same thing For me, I would do the same thing for physical and for digital. It makes sense to only have one organizational system. There is going to be a lot of replication between those two things. You might have physical printouts of things that you marked up, or you might have the final copy physically printed out of your concert program or your poster. There's a good chance that stuff was designed in digital, so you're going to have all of the drafts and all of the other markups and things in digital in your folder. There's no reason not to hold those things in the same place. There are, of course, things that are only created in physical and only created in digital. I totally understand that. Your organizational system really should encompass all of those things. You should sort of conceptualize one big organizational system, and then there's the sort of physical branch and the digital branch. So some of these things are going to be very similar. So say you have a system for your exhibits that you go to, and you have a subfolder for reviews and press. Put social media posts from the audience members in that reviews and press place. You might have a paper news clipping in the physical and a spreadsheet of social media screenshots or posts in the digital. The gallery guest book for the exhibit might only exist in physical, but you can have those social media posts in the digital. Think of them more broadly as sort of attendees' reactions or something like that, some folder that tells you where all that stuff should go. Photos kept on iPhones, is there a better way to keep them? Well, of course. We are going to talk about physical media and storage media a little later. I would argue that a cell phone, although I don't think I included it in it, is a physical media device, and those things age and they get old and they get obsolete, or you drop them and they crack and they break. Not every person who has a fancy digital, fancy cell phone is necessarily going to have an automated backup setup. Some of us do, some of us don't. So the thing you really want to think about is if there are photos that go into this system as an organization or as evidence of your professional practice, as those types of records, you want to get them into your digital organizational system as quickly as possible. And we're going to talk about sort of the practicalities of what that looks like in a second, but I will come back to this. So there's a good chance that you do not have something fancy like a SharePoint or a document management system or a shared drive or anything like that. Like I have been talking about, there's a good chance you have a Google Drive or a Dropbox folder that runs everything for your organization. It's okay. It's good to have things all in one place as opposed to sort of trapped inside a SharePoint or even trapped inside a WordPress or something like that where you can't get it out again. Having these things all in one place is, you know, it can be a bit of a jumble, but it's certainly easier to preserve things and capture them if it's all in one place, if it's not very fancy. You really just need to think about whether it's safe and whether it's accessible. So make sure you're not the only one with the passwords. Make sure that the passwords don't get lost. Make sure that there's some kind of system for backups. So as I mentioned, your iPhone might be doing backups to the cloud. That's great. That means that there's 2 copies, one on your phone and one on Apple's servers somewhere. Which is wonderful. I would argue that the more backups, the better. So Google Drive has a system where, you know, there's redundant copies of all of your Google Drive data on multiple servers across the world. If one server goes down or is suddenly inaccessible for some reason for a few minutes, another one kicks up. So your stuff's always available there. You should always have your own backup. If Google Drive or Dropbox goes out of business tomorrow, they don't owe you anything. So you should always, always, always have your own copy sitting on a hard drive that you own. So while your iPhone is one and the Apple server is another, you should copy stuff off of your phone onto a hard drive in your possession as your third. That is the absolute best way to do it. So a single point of failure can be technical or it can be a human. So just keep that stuff in mind. Do succession planning, so make sure that things are long-term. So if your executive director or your board of directors changes according to, you know, time-limited terms, make sure that that stuff gets passed on and is enshrined in a contract and enshrined in your training documentation and your paperwork. Oh, okay, so this is another image. This is that file that I linked earlier about file naming conventions. This is the kind of documentation that Stanford provides to educators and people who work for them and administrators. So they give you recommendations on how to format the date They give you recommendations on which special characters to avoid. So it can get very, very detailed. You don't have to be this detailed, but you may want to consider copying this and having it around just in case someone asks you. So this is an image, which is our next question break. Is there anyone who has anything they would like to ask or contribute? Okay, I guess not. So we're going to move on. And with that, we are halfway through. Okay, so you've got a bunch of inactive records. What do you do with them? Just to reiterate, records aren't archived unless they're accessible. Access is people. That's a really important part. You may have a organization that's large enough, like a bank, like Scotiabank, to hire someone who just works in the archives. That's great. There's a chance that you are not as big as Scotiabank, which means that you may have a bunch of boxes in somewhere in your office that you consider to be your archives. They're not really archives if they're not accessible. And accessible doesn't mean that the front desk person can unlock the closet for you by request and let you in. It means there's a person around to answer questions and help you and take care of it and knows the collection. So archives is people, access is people. Okay, so let's say you have your home office, which is attached to your home studio where you make all your art, and you have a filing cabinet or two full of stuff. There is a good chance that you don't think about the inactive records filed in with the active records unless you run out of space. I totally understand. You should remove your inactive records, but you should not do this haphazardly. And haphazard is really when you run out of space. That's sort of the most haphazard that it gets. So I would suggest doing it regularly. Do it once a year or once every couple years, if that works for you. If you have stuff organized by date, it's really easy because then you can say, well, it's been 5 years. So I'm going to remove the stuff from 5 years ago. It's this drawer right here. That's great. Once these things are removed, they should preserve the original organizational system. Unless things are totally chaotic, there's no sense in organizing stuff now. Again, when you take them away, you have to keep them safe and up off the floor. When you move stuff away from one place to another, you have to document it. You should have a spreadsheet or even a word processing document. Just write down who you are, when you moved stuff, how much you moved, and where they are now. And you might be moving stuff from your home office to your basement. It's entirely possible. As long as you write that down, it's better than nothing. You should be taking this time when you remove stuff to assess those preservation needs. Different formats and different materials are going to have different preservation requirements. Your straight papers are really, really easy to keep safe. You know, get them away from moisture, get them away from pests, put them in Rubbermaid tubs, that's great. Some of these other things are going to be really, really complicated. So if you have USB sticks, you really want to copy the stuff off of that USB sticks into your one hard drive to remove them all as quickly as possible. Photographs are more inclined to disintegrate no matter what the conditions, so you need to keep a harder eye on those. Things like audio and video media, cassettes, VHSs, Betamaxes, 8-tracks. The longer you leave them, the harder it is to access them. So you should be keeping them separate and worrying about them degrading, but you should also be thinking about digitizing them. And I think we're going to talk about that now. Okay, we're going to do paper preservation first. Preservation and conservation are two different terms that relate to each other. Preservation is keeping stuff safe all the time. Conservation is doing restoration or emergency work. So that's the acute, whereas preservation is the chronic thing that you should be doing all the time. If on your regular checking of your records in your attic or in your basement, you discover rust, there's a good chance that it's a humidity problem. You can buy a hygrometer, which is something that I always forget the name of, but you can buy one for 10, 20 bucks, and that'll measure the humidity in a location. And you can find guidelines online according to what type of materials you're storing and what kind of humidity they should be in. You can use a dehumidifier. Not very fancy household one would be fine. Rust is probably coming from metal, so that'll be staples or paper clips or 3-ring binders, that sort of thing. So if the rust is really bad, you're going to want to remove that metal. For the most part, you don't need to worry about it unless that humidity thing is a big problem. If you have mold, again, humidity is contributing to it. Mold travels fast, so if you see it, you need to isolate that item, you need to dry it out, and then you probably want to enclose it. These polypropylene sleeves you can get at Staples are great for that. You can get a box of 500 for like 20 bucks. Acid-free envelopes and folders you can also get at any store. They're not too expensive. And you're going to want to use acid-free folders and acid-free boxes anyways, because if you don't, they will contribute to that mold problem over time. If you have something that's ripped in half, do not try to restore it. Just put it in an envelope and mark it as fragile. Don't laminate it, don't glue it, don't put tape on it. Someone else will do it if it's important. Again, pests, Rubbermaid tubs. If your pages are curling, it's too humid. If your pages are crumbling, it's not humid enough. There is always a chance that you are in a not humid enough situation. So that's where that hygrometer comes in. For the most part, homes are more humid than they need to be. So you're going to have problems with all the stuff higher up on this list more often than you're going to have a pages crumbling problem. And again, enclosing stuff in no Scotch tape, excellent, yes. And enclosing stuff in Rubbermaid tubs is going to help with a lot of this, because if you can get humidity the way you want it and then put the lid on, it's going to hold for a lot longer than, you know, than your leaky basement necessarily will. For fancy stuff, of course, there are always professionals. You can always find a professional somewhere who will take care of these things if you want to pay them for it. There's a good chance you don't want to pay them for it, so preservation is good to prevent the need for a conservator. I'm going to skip over this time, just as I did in our last time. You can come and look at this later. Measuring is really helpful in case you are calculating how much offsite storage or how many boxes you need to buy or how many Rubbermaid tubs you need to buy, but I'm not going to go over this right now. You can come back to these slides later. Oh, I am going to talk about digitizing sides though. If for some reason you decide that you want to digitize, and we're going to talk about this later, there are some different file formats and recommendations on quality. Those are going to be in the resources that go on the USB stick that I will share with you. So you will have an idea of how much digital space is going to be taken up if you decide that you want to digitize things. Okay, so here is the good stuff. You might find yourselves in a situation where you don't want to deal with a print section and a digital section. You probably have those in your active business processes, but once you're moving things to inactive, maybe you just don't want to deal with having a hard drive of inactive records that you have to keep safe and keep redundant backups of. So should we just print everything? I will argue that the answer is almost always no. There is only really one situation in which I would say yes, that you should print everything, and it's if all of these things on the left are true. If you're really bad at digital, and all of your records are really simple. You don't have any complicated records at all, things that can print really, really easily. And you have nobody who can help you with the digital thing. And if you have an organization that doesn't have anybody on staff who can help you, and you don't have any sort of centralized office or hard drive or technological infrastructure, then there is a good chance that printing might be the answer for you. But again, that also is dependent on volume. You cannot print 20 years worth of records, even if they're super simple, and even if you're really bad at everything digital. Almost every other case, the answer is going to be no. If you can manage even the simplest of digital collections, if you can pass a hard drive around or 2 hard drives, if you have a centralized space where things can be stored so people can get at them, and if you have any complicated files at all, including spreadsheets or Photoshop files or anything like that, the answer is almost always no. Should we just digitize everything? There's also lots of reasons why the answer is no to this as well, including if you don't have time. Digitization is complicated, and it takes training, and it takes a lot of time and a lot of money and equipment. If your digital infrastructure is not totally reliable, which is to say you're not already paying a lot of money for a redundant backup system, you probably don't want to digitize all your paper stuff and put it into that. If you're going to keep making paper records also, there's no reason to get digitizing on your backload of materials if you're going to keep making paper in the future. There are lots of really fun, exciting, interesting things that you are making as artists that cannot be digitized. Taking digital photos of things that you just don't have the space for, as we talked about with Wendy's signage problem. Yes, you can take a digital photo and then get rid of the original, but for the most part, you probably have things that you want to keep around in their original form. Should you just digitize some things, as we have talked about, things that are fragile and in a fixed format that is on a physical legacy media like a VHS, definitely digitize those. Photographs and negatives, also very fragile. Newspaper pages are notoriously crumbly because they're just bad quality paper, so do digitize those. Anything else that you consider to be fragile, definitely digitize. So here we're going to talk a little bit more about those formats, and this is where I would include a cell phone as a physical media, although I didn't put it on the slide. So if you have film reels, there's always a chance. If you have VHS, if you have audio cassettes, if you have ripped CDs that are crumbling, slides and negatives, microfilm and microfiche I put on, although there's a very low chance of you having that. And for some of you, you might have things like maps or blueprints or really, really big papers that are hard to store. Those things I would suggest definitely need to be digitized sooner rather than later. And again, artworks in three-dimensional works, fiber arts, sculpture, those sorts of things. They are at risk and fragile, mostly based on their size. And it is really important to document them in as many ways as possible if you can, and to keep those things in digital, even though you're probably going to keep some of these physical objects around. And again, digital media carriers, so SD cards, external hard drives, floppy disks, zip drives, and USB keys. All those things should be copied into one centralized location as quickly as possible. Your main concern here is, especially with some of these audio and video things, you are going to hit that long tail of the physical devices you need to be able to play these things. You will be able to find, if not for-profit vendors, then even public libraries and some media centers will have that equipment for you and will be able to digitize those things for you. You can either do it yourself or for free, or you can pay a vendor to do it. There are lots in the Toronto area. You want to do it as quickly as possible. The sooner you deal with it, the easier it will be. And for these things that are just kind of bulky and awkward, taking photos is a really, really great solution. Once you have it in digital, you're going to want to keep multiple copies, and we're going to talk about that in a second. So, the most advanced and fanciest and ISO standard digital storage systems for good quality digital preservation operate on a very simple principle. And the principle is lots of copies, keep stuff safe. This is the actual real acronym that we use. It's the LOCKSS model. I know it sounds a bit silly, but it's true. This is what very, very high paid professionals operate on. So you can create a LOCKSS model system very easily in your own environment, as I talked about before. You have one copy that you are working with in your Google Drive, and then you want to make sure that there's a redundant copy of that somewhere else, probably on a hard drive. You want to think about this as being a physical problem and also as a technical problem. So there are hard drives that you can buy that will in themselves have a redundant copy of everything you put on them. And then if one half of the hard drive fails, or if there's a little bit of glitchiness where one file gets corrupted on one, it goes and looks at the other and just copies it back over again, and then you have two copies again. So they're great. I really, really like the LaCie Rugged drive that is 2 terabytes and has a redundant copy. It's about $400. It's waterproof and drop proof, which is great for me because I'm clumsy. Once you have those files securely on one drive, you want to make sure that if that drive goes up in a house fire, you have another copy somewhere else as well. So you can use another Google Drive for this. Like I said, that cloud service itself has a redundancy built into it, which is great, even though those companies could go out of business tomorrow. Or you could have another drive that's just like that and give it to someone that you trust, so that it's in someone else's house. So if they have a house fire or you have a house fire, one of those copies is still good. You have to update all copies each time you add something. People tend to forget that part, but all of your 2 or 4 or 6 or 8 copies have to be identical for this system to work. So you have to write that down and do it at tax time or whenever you decide to do all of these other things occasionally. Make sure that those things are all up to date. Oh, this is a scary image. Again, this is another opportunity for questions because we've hit the end of a section. And I really, really like this image because it has these question marks at the bottom. And I have no idea what it means. This is a really, really advanced version of what I was just talking about. So a RAID 1 system is 2 drives that are identical. And then you get into this sort of like array of identical drives like Inception. It just goes on forever. And I really, really love these colored arrows at the bottom that mean absolutely nothing. I like that the person who put this image together was like, I don't know what this means. So this is your opportunity to ask some more questions if you have any.
Julian, again, more of a comment than a question, just that the storage needs can get pretty large pretty quickly.
Very large, very quickly.
And so, like, speaking for the Oakville Museum, in that we a few years ago upgraded significantly our collections management system to a enterprise grade, like the same system that museums like the Met and the British Museum use. Mm-hmm. However, what we didn't get with it was the digital asset management system. Mm-hmm. And the storage requirements for our digital assets, even though they are modest, are much greater than the storage requirements for our main collections. And they're related. So it's something that you kind of have to think about in terms of what file sizes are we going to use, and like how much of the storage am I going to need to kind of get the minimum at least going.
Yeah, the estimating in advance how much money you are willing to pay for how much space you might need in 5 years from now, it's a real pain. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And
this is a discussion I have with our information services people in terms of like, you know, it is something that even the level of storage that we need, which isn't incredible, is not something that the corporation would like to take on in terms of their enterprise, like redundant storage solution. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's astronomically expensive.
Yes, it absolutely
to do it that way. So your suggestion around doing it around like, you know, kind of modest physical storage is probably the best way. But even that way, you're gonna have to do some thinking to decide what do I need. Is it 2 terabytes? Is it 8 terabytes? Like, what is it?
Yeah, and I'm just processing the budget that we are preparing for this project and going, well, I know roughly how fast we'll be digitizing things and therefore how much stuff we'll have at the end of 3 years. And it's going to be a lot if we have success. The greater success of this project, the more money we're going to need to make it a success because there will be a lot of stuff in digital to deal with. Catherine has asked, are USB sticks good for long-term storage? No, for the one specific reason that they don't have this RAID redundant storage thing. You could have 2 USB sticks that are identical. Oh, and one thing I forgot to mention here, which is true for these hard drives as well as for USB sticks, is that all hard drives fail at some point. There are a lot of tests done that say the average external hard drive, and I include USB sticks and everything else in this, lasts for about 8 years. And I would round that down to 5 years just to be sure that you don't hit that 8-year anniversary and discover that everything's already dead. Every 5 years, buy a new hard drive and move everything over. Stop using the old one because the old one is no longer reliable after 5 years. So if you have 2 USB sticks where you're doing this, you know, this at-home lock system and they're identical, yeah, maybe you could trust that for 5 years, but I wouldn't. The best example I can say is that we bought USB sticks for this project that I'm going to send to you later. They're from a vendor that put our logo on them, which is great. I don't know who made them. I don't know how reliable they are. I don't know the quality of the technology inside. I only know what I paid for them. And for what I paid for them, I would not plan to use them as a long-term storage. I wouldn't trust it. One of these drives that I'm talking about, these $400 drives, please use one of those if you're even considering doing a USB stick solution. I would not leave stuff on USB sticks for love or money. I hope that answered your question. Okay, so the very last section before I let you all go home, and I'm going to try and rush through this real quick so we can go home quicker, is about donation. Oh yeah, and Julian said the more often you read and write to USB sticks, the more often you should replace them. So if it's something that you use actively to take, you know, your presentation to work and give there, or take files from home to work and back, or give to friends, the more often you use it, the less you should rely on it. So I was imagining you buying new USB sticks for your storage solution, but of course, yes, don't pull one out of the drive and think one out of your drawer in your desk and expect it's going to last for 5 years from that point. Okay, so our very last section is about archival donation. As I said, I don't recommend that you start your own archive in your basement. There's always a possibility for some community groups that that is something that you want to pursue, especially in collaboration with other people. But I would recommend that you give your stuff to a professional institution that is doing this en masse, because it's always cheaper and easier to do preservation and access en masse. So let those groups do it. Don't do it yourself. Again, we're going to come back to this problem of art. You have artworks that are sitting with your records. You may want to donate them somewhere. Institutions that accept art may not accept archives. Institutions that accept archives may not accept art. I always think that you should sell that art or donate that art first and foremost. It's good for you. It's a win-win. If you find a place that will accept your art by donation, it may not be the kind of place that will be able to exhibit it. It may not be the kind of place that can preserve it properly. It may not be the kind of place that you want to put on your portfolio. And it certainly may not be the kind of place that can accept even the provenance documents related to that art, let alone the rest of your archive. When it comes to archival institutions that collect archives and records, it's very easy to donate photographs or video documentation, much easier than donating the actual artwork itself. And it's almost always easier to donate digital copies these days than to donate physical items. Physical items come with a lot more concerns for very limited space in most archival institutions, and a lot are getting easier and better at accepting digital copies all the time. So this is specific to Oakville and the groups that we've been talking to for this project. I have said collecting institutions with an asterisk, because just because they have a collections mandate and their entire purpose is to be a collection doesn't mean that they are collecting right now at this exact moment. It's important to note that cultural heritage is just as cash-strapped as artists are. We really are all in this together, and it doesn't mean that they have space or time right this minute. It may mean that they have accepted already more things than they can ever process, given that their staff is a limited resource. So they may have a backlog, and they may get back in touch with you 10 years from now if you reach out to them today and say, okay, we're ready. It's not about you, it's about them. And getting in touch never hurts, because it puts you on their radar, and they may be able to say, well, maybe if we shifted some things around and prioritized, you know, now that we know what's out there, a lot of these places can only really accept what's offered to them. They don't have time to go chasing things. So put yourself on their radar and reach out. It's always a good idea. So here are some suggestions if you are in our target audience. Oakville Museum, as I said, Julian, accepts artifacts, and I know they have a small artwork collection. I'm not volunteering them as a place that's going to appraise your stuff, but of course, getting in contact never hurts. The Oakville Historical Society was in attendance at our last webinar, and they take records and archives and paperwork. I know that they also have a small art collection, but they have a storage problem as well. The other historical societies in town, and then of course the Province-wide Archives of Ontario. There are some other province-wide groups, like the Ontario Historical Society has a library for published things and for booklets, brochures, posters, which we use the term ephemera for. And of course, depending on who you are and what you make and how famous you are, you may want to talk to Library and Archives Canada. So those are all archives very generally. Specifically for artists, there's nothing really local, which is why our project is needed. You will find some things at the provincial level, the national level, depending on your discipline. And then there are some other archives, like the Canadian Lesbian and Gay Archives, now known as the Archives, that will collect things based on different lived experiences. This list at the bottom, the Wikipedia list of archives in Canada, is a really great place to go and look for. Depending on where you live in the world, you may have a similar list on Wikipedia or provided by an association of some kind. Here are some examples. This is the Oakville Historical Society. This is straight off of their website. They accept donations of artifacts. Their collection is entirely dependent on donations from the public, so don't throw out your family documents or photographs. They love photographs. They love documents, including letters, wills, deeds, family histories, and they accept book donations as well. They have an acquisitions committee. They do not have a really, really detailed collections mandate online, but that acquisition committee is going to consider everything on a case-by-case basis. If they decide that they can't take things, they will tell you why. That's great. That's sort of the average of what you will find from some of these places if you just go and start looking online. This kind of information is about all you're going to be offered, and then once you get in touch, they'll tell you more about how this works. The dance collection, the Canadian Dance Collection, their website says this: they accept materials depending on its relevance to the history of dance in Canada, its relevance to other artifacts and records in the collection. Interesting. It depends on its condition, of course. Like I said, those scared straight images, do not try to donate boxes like that, because some places, they just won't be able to take it if it takes too much work to get it into an accessible state. Depending on its research and exhibit potential, and of course, it depends on the institution's ability to maintain that collection safely and securely later. Priority will be given to artifacts and archival records associated with key periods, events, places, organizations, institutions, businesses, and individuals. And one more example, this is the Archives, formerly the Canadian Lesbian and Gay Archives. They're in Toronto. They accept any materials related to the records and legacy of LGBTQ2+ stories and lives. They accept personal organizational records, books, periodicals, love letters, journals, visual art, newspapers, photographic materials, audiovisual materials, clothes, costumes, sex toys, broadsides, posters, flyers, artifacts, and electronic media. And they allude to something we're going to talk about next, which is the deed of gift, the paperwork that goes along with this transfer of materials. I do think you should reach out to these collecting institutions right away, get on their radar, let them know that you have stuff, let them know roughly what you have and when you might be considering getting rid of it. Definitely plan around something convenient, like if you're moving your house or your office, or if you are dealing with someone who is getting their affairs in order and writing their will and doing that sort of stuff. Do that kind of estate planning with them and plan it now rather than later. Do consider whether you might want to partner with other groups and do a collective donation, or partner with similar artists, people that you've collaborated with in the past who work in the same media as you. It's a really good idea to try and work with them and figure out if you can have some strength in numbers. If you're an active artist or an active group, there's a very good chance you will want to add more material in the future. You may think of archival donation as a one-time thing that happens way later when you are no longer active. Not always. You can sign an agreement now to move what you have now and put in that agreement further additions, or accruals is the technical term we use. Do make a list of several collecting institutions that you think would be viable. Reach out to one or a couple of them and see what they say. Something that I've put in this list that I know is not going to be possible for everyone, but you should consider it, is fundraising. It can be a little bit of a foot in the door if you say, I have all these materials and I also have some money to contribute towards the cost that it will be for you to process it and make it available, or the cost of the long-term storage. Like I said, archives are cash-strapped. Sometimes these things do make a difference. And this is a really great opportunity to galvanize your support base and your audience members. If you're doing fundraising with people who care about your mission, they may care about putting some money towards this as well. Many organizations that you reach out to will sort of steward you along. If your materials are not appropriate for that collection, they may help you find a place where it could go, but you may also want to find a professional who can facilitate and be a consultant and work with you on your end as well. The transfer home process. Once you find a potential home, they will do most of these things. This is what they'll do on their end. And this is where all the stuff we've talked about comes into play. Condition appraisal. If your stuff is just in too bad condition, it is too much work for them. And that may be a reason to say no, even if you are interesting and valuable and your stuff is interesting and valuable. There's a chance that it may be too big or too small, depending on what they're looking for. So having an idea of how much size you have to donate and estimate what those further accruals will be. Estimating the workload to process it. They may have an idea of how much they want to keep. You could give them 10 boxes and they know they're only going to keep 2 and they're going to return 8 to you. So they may have that appraisal process already in mind. When it comes to things that you've created, copyright and privacy are usually pretty straightforward, but of course you're collecting things that you've received as well. So copyright and legal concerns come into play for them. If it's too risky or too dangerous, they may say no. If they have found people who are creators of stuff that you own, they may need to contact those people to talk about permission from them. They may ask you to do it or they may do it. That you need to make a plan for those future editions. We're going to talk about that accruals process in a second. You will have to sign some paperwork. It may be called a donation agreement or a deed of gift. It is a legal contractual document. There may be a financial appraisal involved. Your donation may be considered a financial donation and you may get a charitable tax receipt, depending on whether you ask for that or insist on it, depending on whether that's easier for them to do. Once all this stuff is really officially received, they will do further processing and appraisal. They may return things they don't want. They may just destroy them, depending on what you two have agreed on. They will look at the arrangement of the stuff that they received. They will document it. They will describe it. They will write a blurb about you. They will put all that stuff on their website, and they will begin to promote the collection. If you are interested in learning more about this internal process, I cannot recommend anything more than the Peel Region Art Gallery Museum and Archives. Their archives staff have a blog that has an amazing amount of information on it. So they will walk through all of this stuff with you. And something I really want to note that they mention is that they will help donors find an institution with a better fit. This is going to be true of a lot of people that you talk to. They will help you find a home for things. Something I'm really not supposed to talk about, but I do anyways, is that some of the really big and interesting collections in the world were saved because the person who owned them threatened to throw it all in a dumpster if it wasn't collected, or threatened to light a match. I'm not saying you should do that. Please do not put that in your introductory email. Do not threaten to blow all your stuff up. But the instinct for all of us, that's why we got into this field, is to save things and to make sure that they're safe. So there is a not small chance that they will not say no to you. They will try and find a home for these things with you. They will work with you. And I also want to note that they also mention, again, appraisal is never over. Just because they appraise things and they whittle it down and they write a description and a finding aid for it doesn't mean that they won't revisit that in 10 years or 20 years or 50 years, depending on changing conditions. They might save stuff now that 50 years from now they go, I guess nobody really wanted that and we misjudged the value of that. So they may get in contact later and try to return stuff, or they may destroy stuff. That could be in your deed of gift. They may give themselves the right to do that, or you may make stipulations about how to do that. So there's really only a few reasons why you would do a one-time donation. The individual would be deceased or the organization is folded, essentially. All of those records are inactive. That's a very simple agreement that you can make, but for most of the people that are listening to this, you're going to want to think about a continuing agreement. Making provisions for further accruals of records should include when they're made, how much they estimate. They may have stipulations on their end based on what kind of formats they want. Maybe they only want digital accruals in the future. Maybe they only want a certain amount of materials, or maybe they just want whatever you produce every 5 years. Where should they be delivered? Who's your contact? How that process goes. Make sure that all of that stuff is in your deed of gift. Make sure that that agreement is written down and signed by both parties. Make it as specific as you can, knowing that things change and people move and all that stuff. When the archive staff finish processing your donation and they publish stuff, they will let you know. Then you should throw a party. It is a really exciting and wonderful thing that your stuff has been preserved and made available. You want to let people know about it. You have fans and audience members who may want to use that collection. You should make a big promotional brouhaha about it. It's really, really important that you celebrate this. You need to update your website. You need to give information. You need to invite people to use your collections. You need to be really clear about what's in those collections so people know if it's valuable. You have an agreement for further donations most likely, so you need to keep up your records management at home, and you always want to stay in touch with the archives that has your stuff. You always want to be on their mailing list. You always want to know when things change. If they're doing fundraising, it's good for you to promote that too. Because who knows what could happen to them and their building in the future. So do stay in touch and keep that relationship alive. The one thing you are probably wondering is what happens if no one wants your stuff? Don't despair. Like I said, it's not always you, sometimes it's them. Conditions change, keep trying, try every 5 years, try every 10 years. Continue to think about things like finding partners and building strength in numbers. Find your collaborating artists or similar artists. Look at different ways to look at different collecting institutions' mandates and think about the regions that you qualify for or the subject-based collections that you qualify for. Again, consider hiring a consultant or a facilitator because you might just have too much stuff and they can come into your home and consolidate some of that down to make it a tighter collection and more appealing for a donation. They can help you appraise those things that you have at home. I do site visits, lots of people do site visits. It's not always easy to tell based on some photos or the text of your email what you have, but getting in touch with a consultant and just figuring out how that works is the first step. And as I said before, it's easier and easier to donate digital things right now than it is to donate physical. One of the things that the Oakville Historical Society told me is that they would be very happy to accept digital copies from lots of community groups, whereas accepting physical things is a little harder right now. But number one, do not despair and do keep my contact information. If you find yourself in this situation, feel free to reach out. Okay. This is my very last question break. We're running a bit out of time, so I'm going to just zip through my last slide or two, and then we will have a big discussion at the end. Things we haven't talked about that I don't have time for. Digital formats and file formats. Very, very complicated subject. Cannot get into it now. There will be some guidelines and resources on those USB sticks, and I might edit these slides and have a link in here as well. Copyright and privacy, if you're the sort of organization that works with children or people who cannot give consent, you have a lot of privacy concerns that you need to worry about, that you need to deal with in your records right now while they're active, before they become a huge problem later at the point of archival donation. If you have lots of stuff contributed from lots of people, they will ask for waivers and permissions before they accept those materials. So that's really important to get straight now. Digitization quality and standards, again, also related to digital formats. No time to talk about that now. I will share some resources. We haven't talked about starting your own archives a lot because my short answer is don't. I really don't recommend it. But if you do want to think about being an organization or a group of organizations that is big enough to have one, I would recommend getting in touch with some other arts archives like the Stratford Festival because they're great and they do some really great stuff. To remind you, the reason why we're doing these webinars is because of this project. There's going to be a survey that we're going to be putting out soon if you're a member of the community or if you are an expat somewhere else, but you have a tie to Oakville. We would love to include you, especially if you possess records that may be of interest, but even if you don't, we're thinking about an oral history component as well, so there will be interviews, and we want to talk to people anyways. We'll be publishing the study on our website when it's done. You'll all get copies. And that's it. There's my contact information, which I wanted to leave up for an extended period of time so you can write it down if you want. Okay, I'm going to go to Wendy first, who has a question, and then we will go from there. Wendy, you are muted right now, but you can unmute yourself or you can type. It's up to you.
Cool.
Oh, Wendy, you are not showing as having a microphone, so you might not have your audio set up. If you're talking, we definitely can't hear you, but it's probably because it's not recognizing your audio. Okay, now it's showing you. There we go. Yep.
Sorry about that. Sorry about that.
No worries.
I kind of represent two organizations here. So I represent the Oakville Film Festival.
Mhm.
I'm the executive director, but I'm also on the vice president of the Oakville Choral Society. So they're two different organizations in that one pretty much has all physical archives, while the other one has kind of a mix of digital and physical archives. And I'm just wondering, in terms of the digital material, what's the best way of just archiving that myself? Like, to just put everything into a folder? Because I know we've got tons of different stuff from 7 or 8 years for the film festival, whereas for the choir, we've got physical archives, which I believe you've got a lot of that with that Penny and Linda had brought in. So I'm just curious.
Yes, and I really wish we had done this in a physical workshop because you guys have such an interesting filing system for that. Is Penny the one? Am I getting the names mixed up?
Yeah,
Yes.
Penny has the stuff. She has boxes.
Penny and the Binders.
Yeah, Penny and the Binders. Yeah.
Which would be a great pop group name. Yeah, you guys have such a wonderful physical system. I wish there was an easy way to get Penny to sort of embrace digital and move into that, but she's very cautious, which I respect greatly. So I don't know if you were here for this part, this suggestion of, yes, having everything centralized in your digital collection, keeping it all in one place, and then making multiple copies of that one place is really the best answer for that. So this information, there are a couple slides about this, but I will chat with you more about this later, because I know I have your contact information because we've already talked about both groups.
Yes.
And if this project goes through, we will work much more closely with you because we'll have more time to come up with a better system for every community group that's part of the project.
Okay, perfect.
But yeah, this is sort of the Coles Notes version for now. So if you grab a copy of these slides and come back to them later, read it over a few times and then get an email contact with me and we can chat.
Great. Okay, thanks, Alana.
Sure. Julian, I don't know if you have your hand up or not. Oh, you do.
I do, yeah. Just kind of jumping in on just to back up some of the stuff you said, that for sure reach out to us. Our curator of collections, Carolyn Cross, is great and a fountain of help and information. Our mandate is very specific to Oakville, but it's always better to ask than not to ask. And I really liked your story about threatening to set a match to things. And I'm trying to remember which member of which group of 7 guy it was, whether it was Varley or Casson or I can't remember, but basically in his will, he directed that his personal papers be destroyed, and his lawyer ignored him.
Yep. And artists are the best for that. They're so temperamental, you know. We love the idea of ephemeral artworks, and we're very happy to extend that to ourselves. His
lawyer was just like, no, I'm not going to do that.
No. Sometimes people need to be rescued from their own ego, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is there anyone else with a pressing question? I should put this back to my contact information, sorry. If you don't have a pressing question or you have a question that you would rather have me answer in private, of course, reach out to me. Erin, you have your hand up and you are muted.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, I was just curious about your last comment on...
Oh, you have remuted somehow. I don't know if we did that or if you did that.
Sorry.
Oh, there you are.
That's like, that's all right?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I had a question about what you were saying about institutions sort of moving toward accepting digitized material over kind of original pieces, which I kind of wonder about for a couple of reasons. One being that our digitized formats really kind of replacements for material records. For instance, it sounds like there are some textile artists here. Obviously, that kind of interaction between a digital sort of surrogate versus an actual kind of the capacity to sort of engage with actual materials is very different. That so that kind of question on the one hand, but then on the other hand of like, is it actually, is it actually much, digital files actually still themselves require space as well.
Oh, they require so much.
Yeah, exactly. So like, I'm kind of wondering whether like what that kind of tendency is about when
there are
like a lot of physical material is actually much easier to take care of in a lot of ways.
Definitely. So there are lots and lots of, this is the longest conversation in history in my profession right now. The digital dark ages is the phrase that we use to describe the last 30 or so years when people really started making stuff in digital, but started making stuff in digital in sort of like a incunable form, like not really very reliable in weird proprietary formats, companies that went out of business, your Corel WordPerfect 1.0 word processing document, not actually accessible now, even though it's just a word processing document. Digital is really, really hard and complicated, and there's a very long tail of things that we do to deal with it. But physical is complicated for a different set of reasons, which is mainly money and space and time. Physical is something that people have been making a lot of for the last 100 years when we really went crazy with records. And we're finding that it is impossible for us to even accept it in the first place, even though storing it and taking care of it and offering access is really difficult. There's also sort of an inverse thing where big organizations like Library and Archives Canada are really, really not getting good at digital anytime soon. It's a big, slow-moving juggernaut, and they're not doing well. They're happy to take physical stuff and make that process really easy. Whereas small groups like the Oakville Historical Society, I would not have suggested them as being interested in taking digital donations. They said, sure, why not? Because they are able to move a little faster and do things in a little more of a DIY manner, but do it more quickly. And so they're willing to try. They might fail, but they're willing to try. So there's this really interesting tension, like all these different factors coming into play. There's a digital dark ages, but there's an archival physical dark ages happening now as well. And so it really depends on the place, and it really depends on what systems they are willing to have set up. And if they happen to have been able to hire someone in the last few years who's willing to take this on. So all these things are happening all at the same time, and many articles are being written about it. I don't know if that answered your question, but it's fascinating, and I could obviously talk about it for hours, but we're running out of time. So thank you all for coming so much. I really appreciate your attendance here today. Do grab a copy of the link to the slides, and do reach out to me anytime you feel. I'm around. I'm here to answer your questions, and I'm here to work more closely with you if you require that sort of thing. Happy to do it. And I'm going to be with the Oakville Arts Council up until the end of this month. So you can always reach me there up until the end of April. Yeah, thank you so much. We really appreciate chatting with you all today.
Okay, thank you everybody for coming. If there's no comments or questions, and you think of something, please reach out to Alana or myself. But I hope you enjoyed today's presentation. I know Alana is just chock full of information, and we really appreciate her efforts to get this information to folks. But I think that's it. So I will probably end the meeting if there's no other questions or comments.